Life stories often teach us lessons we never expect to learn. Today, we bring you a story of love, betrayal, and finding strength in the face of adversity. This is a tale of a bride who found herself trapped by the very people who were supposed to support her, her soon-to-be in-laws. What happened the night before her wedding changed everything. It's a story about standing up for yourself, trusting the person you love, and breaking free from toxic control. Join us as we dive into this emotional roller coaster. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. I never thought something like this would happen to me. I had heard of controlling in-laws, and I'd read those horror stories online. I always thought, wow, at least I don't have to deal with that kind of nightmare. But on the night before my wedding, I learned just how far some people are willing to go to get what they want. And what they wanted was for me to disappear. My name is Sarah, and I'm 29 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois. Last weekend, I was supposed to get married to the love of my life, the only person in his family who actually respects me. His name is Jake. We had chosen a small, beautiful resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, for our wedding. It was supposed to be simple, elegant, and intimate. My parents were thrilled, and even Jake's extended family was excited. But his parents? They couldn't hide their coldness, their indifference. I was already used to their judgmental looks and their passive-aggressive comments. His mother, Karen, was the worst. She always made it clear that no woman would ever be good enough for her precious son. His father, John, just followed her lead, like a passive business partner instead of a supportive husband. For a long time, I ignored the red flags, the biting remarks, the subtle exclusions from family gatherings. The times Karen would casually tell Jake, "You could have any girl you want." It bothered me, but I figured they'd get over it eventually. They didn't, and on the night before our wedding, I realized just how deep the resentment ran. The night was chaotic. The rehearsal dinner had just finished, and the wedding weekend had been packed with last-minute planning, awkward moments, and a whirlwind of emotions. By the time I made it to my hotel room, all I wanted was to crash. I was exhausted, drained, my mind buzzing from the pressure. But as soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. The room looked normal, bed neatly made, curtains drawn, everything in its place. But then, as I set my purse down, I realized my phone charger was missing. I always kept a charger in my purse, but now it was gone. I frowned, digging through my bag, trying to figure out what was wrong. That's when I reached for my phone to text Jake, to let him know I was finally in my room. That's when I heard the click of the door behind me. I turned, startled, and saw Karen and John standing there, blocking the exit. They were both smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something colder, something more sinister. "Sit down," Karen said, her voice sharp. I took a step back, instinctively feeling something wasn't right. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice trembling with confusion. John stepped forward. "We need to talk." I was already starting to feel uneasy. "Whatever you need to say. You can say it to me outside," I said, hoping this would be over quickly. But Karen just sighed, shaking her head like I was a misbehaving child. "This is for his own good," she said, her voice smooth, yet utterly cold. Then she pulled my phone out of her pocket. I froze. "How did she?" I whispered, looking at my purse, where I had just placed it. The phone had been inside, and now it was in her hands. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. "You don't belong in this family," Karen said softly, her words slicing through the air. My heart pounded in my chest. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. John closed the door, locking it behind him. "Oh, shit," I thought. I ran to the door and yanked on the handle. It didn't budge. The windows were bolted shut. I turned back to them, panic rising in my chest. I was trapped, alone, with no phone, no way to call for help. I was completely powerless. Karen smiled, her expression never wavering. "We're giving you time to think," she said, her voice strangely calm. I stood frozen, unable to move. "Think about what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous glint. "Whether you really want to do this." I blinked in disbelief. She wasn't trying to make me leave. She was trying to make Jake think I'd left him. They wanted him to believe I had cold feet. That I had abandoned him. Just like that. You're insane, I whispered. Karen smiled. Unfazed. She tucked my phone into her bag. By morning, you'll realize this was for the best. Then they left, closing the door behind them. I was alone. For a few minutes, I was in shock. This couldn't be real. I couldn't be locked in a hotel room the night before my wedding, with my own future in-laws trying to sabotage everything. Then the panic set in. I searched the room, checking the vents, the air ducts, even trying to force the lock open with a pen from the hotel desk. Nothing worked. I had no way out. No phone, no help. I went to the window. But I was on the 3rd floor. Jumping was out of the question. I pounded on the door. Screamed until my voice was hoarse. No one heard me. Or if they did, they ignored me. Minutes stretched into an hour. I had no idea what was happening outside. Would Jake come looking for me? Would he know something was wrong? Then, after what felt like an eternity, the lock on the door turned. The door burst open, and standing there, breathing hard, eyes blazing, was Jake. I almost collapsed into his arms. But his expression wasn't one of relief. It was fury. His eyes locked on mine. They told me you left, he said, his voice shaking with rage. They said you changed your mind. I took a step forward, my heart racing. They locked me in here, I whispered. His jaw clenched so tightly I was sure his teeth might break. He looked around the room, taking in the missing phone, the bolted windows, the untouched bed. He turned and saw Karen standing behind him, her face pale, John beside her, looking like he was about to launch into damage control. Jake spoke first, his voice cold and dangerous. You locked my fiancé in a hotel room the night before our wedding, he said, his words cutting through the air like a blade. Neither of them responded. Get the hell out, Jake ordered. Karen started to stammer, but Jake didn't let her finish. He slammed the door in their faces. I stood there, my body still shaking, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. But I wasn't scared anymore. Not because I was safe in Jake's arms, but because I realized, in that moment, how deeply he cared about me, how he would fight for me, how he would always choose me over his parents. And that was the moment I knew, our love would survive this. The next morning, I was still shaking. I could hardly believe what had happened. The night before had felt like a nightmare, trapped, powerless, and completely betrayed by the people who should have been the happiest for us. But in Jake's arms, I knew I was safe. I kept telling myself that I had to focus on the wedding, that everything would be okay once we were in front of our guests, exchanging vows. But the lingering anger inside me told me otherwise. I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. Jake was furious. I had never seen him this angry before. And it was a strange mix of emotions. There was hurt, confusion, but mostly, a fiery protectiveness that came alive the moment he found me locked in that room. He was furious with his parents. Furious at the betrayal. And he wasn't going to let it slide. I tried to calm him down. But he wouldn't hear it. He had already made up his mind. He was done with them. They don't get to control me, he said, his voice tight with anger. They don't get to tear us apart. We left the hotel and spent the night in a quiet, secluded place. Just the two of us. It was the first peaceful night we'd had in weeks. And it should have been the happiest night of our lives. But the events of the night before cast a shadow over everything. We didn't sleep much. Both of us too wired. Too overwhelmed by what had happened. Jake stayed awake, running his hand through his hair every so often. His mind clearly working through everything. At around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed. It was a message from his brother. My heart sank as I watched Jake read it. His face going rigid. What is it? I asked softly, a knot tightening in my stomach. Jake turned the phone toward me, showing me the message. It was a photo of Karen and John sitting in the lobby of our wedding venue. Waiting. They hadn't left. They were sitting there like vultures. Waiting for something to happen. My stomach twisted. I knew they wouldn't just give up. They wanted control. And they were willing to do anything to get it. They're not going to leave. Jake muttered under his breath. His voice was calm, but I could hear the fury beneath it. I looked at him, my heart racing. What are we going to do? Jake didn't hesitate. He looked at me, his eyes darkening with resolve. We ruined them, he said, his voice low and steady. I blinked, shocked by his words, but when I saw the determination in his eyes, I understood. Jake wasn't just angry, he was going to fight back in the only way that would matter. He wasn't going to let them manipulate him any longer. At 6 a.m., we got in the car and drove back to the venue. The sun was just starting to rise, and the place looked peaceful, almost serene, but I knew that wouldn't last. Jake squeezed my hand as we walked through the front doors of the venue. And just like that, Karen was on us. Jake, she gasped, rushing toward us. Thank God you've come to your senses. Her voice was shaky, desperate. She reached out for him, trying to grab his hand. But Jake stepped back, his face a mask of calm. Yet I could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. No, he said, his voice firm. I didn't come here to talk. He pulled out his phone and hit play. The voice of his mother, Karen, filled the lobby, loud and clear. This is for his own good. Her voice echoed. You don't belong in this family. By morning, you'll realize this was for the best. Jake didn't flinch as he watched his mother's face drain of color. His father, John, stood up, trying to act calm but failing miserably. He adjusted his jacket like he was preparing for battle. But the fight was already lost. Turn that off, Karen demanded, her voice cracking with panic. Jake didn't budge. You want everyone to know exactly what you did, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. By then, guests had started arriving, and a few family members were present, including some of Jake's cousins and a couple of groomsmen. They were all watching, their eyes flicking between Karen's pale face and Jake's cold, calm demeanor. Karen's mouth dropped open, but she had no words left. The venue manager, a woman in her mid-40s who didn't take crap from anyone, folded her arms and looked at the situation with a sharp eye. Do you really want people like this in your establishment? Jake asked her, and she glanced at the security guards. Without another word, Karen and John were escorted out, their protests echoing through the lobby. Jake stood there, unshaken. He had just thrown his own parents out of his wedding, and he didn't even seem fazed. He turned to me, his jaw tight, but his eyes softened when he saw the look on my face. Are you okay? He asked softly, his voice full of concern. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. Yeah, I whispered, though I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in my life, I felt safe. Safe with Jake. Safe with the man who had just chosen me over his parents. Who had stood up for me when it mattered most. The next hour was a whirlwind of emotions. I was still reeling from what had just happened. Karen and John being escorted out of our wedding venue in front of our guests. The shock was starting to wear off, and the reality of what had transpired was settling in. I could see the tension in Jake's shoulders, the anger still simmering beneath the calm facade he tried to maintain. But there was something else too, relief. Perhaps, that he had taken the first step toward breaking free from the hold his parents had on him for so long. We walked into the bridal suite, still processing everything. Guests had started to trickle in, and the energy was shifting. The tension was palpable, and I could feel the murmur of conversations about what had just transpired in the lobby. But despite all of it, Jake and I were together, and nothing else seemed to matter. We had each other, and that was all that mattered now. The room was quiet for a moment. Then, as we settled in, my phone buzzed. It was a message from one of Jake's cousins, Lucas. He was out in the parking lot, and the message sent a chill through my spine. Your parents are outside. They called the police. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had just happened, Karen and John had resorted to calling the police? They had tried to control everything in our lives, manipulate every situation, but this was the lowest blow. I looked at Jake, and he was already heading for the door. He didn't even hesitate. We're going to handle this, he said, his voice calm but steely. There was no fear in him now. No hesitation. He had already faced them and won. But this? This was the final showdown. The moment that would define the rest of our lives. We rushed outside, and sure enough, a police car was parked near the entrance. Karen was standing there, her eyes wide and full of false desperation, her hands dramatically clasped together. John was beside her, silent, but I could see the smugness in his eyes. They were trying to paint a picture of victimhood, to convince the police that Jake was being held against his will. When the officer approached us, Karen was the first to speak. "Officer, please," she said, her voice shaky. "My son is being kept here against his will. He's being manipulated by her. She locked him in a room. And now he's refusing to come home with us." The officer turned to Jake, who stood tall, his posture unwavering. "Is this true, sir?" he asked, his voice calm. Jake stepped forward, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I am a grown man," he said slowly, his voice firm. "I'm here by my own choice. No one is holding me against my will." The officer looked at him for a moment, then turned back to Karen, his expression unreadable. "Just to be clear, sir," he asked, "you're saying there's no kidnapping here?" Jake nodded. "The only person who was locked in a room last night was my fiancé," he said, his voice low and pointed. The officer blinked, processing the situation. Then he glanced at Karen, who had started to fidget nervously. "Is that true?" the officer asked. "You locked her in a room?" Karen's mouth snapped shut, and her eyes widened. She had no words. Jake didn't wait for her response. He pulled out his phone and showed the officer the video of what had happened the night before. Karen's voice. Her words. The moment she had taken my phone. And the way she had locked me in that room. The officer watched the footage, his face growing more serious with each passing second. Finally, he closed his notepad and looked up at Karen and John, his expression hardening. "So, you're the ones reporting a kidnapping?" he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The officer turned to Jake. "Do you want me to remove them from the premises?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "Get them out of here." Without another word, the officer signaled to security, and Karen and John were escorted out of the venue. The last thing I heard before they were out of sight was Karen's shrill voice, screaming about how we were making a terrible mistake. But it didn't matter anymore. I stood there, watching as they were removed from our wedding. The guests, who had been watching from a distance, slowly started murmuring, exchanging glances. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced with a sense of relief. Jake turned to me, his eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. "Yeah," I whispered. "I'm okay. I don't know what to say anymore." Jake smiled, though his eyes were still full of anger. "You don't have to say anything. They're gone, and that's all that matters." He pulled me into his arms. And for the first time since everything started, I felt peace. The chaos had ended. The nightmare was over. We were free. And we had each other. And that was all we needed. As the ceremony went on without any more interruptions, the day slowly began to feel like the dream we had envisioned. It wasn't the wedding we had planned. Not at all. But it was our wedding. And it was beautiful. The love we shared was stronger than ever. And that was all that mattered. As we stood before our guests, exchanging vows, there was a newfound sense of freedom and strength between us. Freedom from the toxic control of his parents. And the strength to move forward together. After everything had calmed down, we received a letter from Jake's parents. A last-ditch effort to guilt him back into their arms. It was filled with manipulation. With Deborah's usual charm. But Jake didn't even flinch. He read it once, then laughed. For the first time in his life, he was free of their influence. And the best part? He didn't need them anymore. In the end, we learned something profound. Love, trust, and respect are the foundations of a healthy relationship. Everything else is secondary. The greatest lesson was how to stand up for each other, even when the world seems against you. As we drove off into the night, hand in hand, I realized that despite the chaos and the heartbreak, we had come out stronger. United by a love that couldn't be broken. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more life stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for future videos. Until next time, remember, love is worth fighting for.